Well, welcome, welcome. My name is Tonya Thames-Taylor, and I am a professor at Westchester University in the Department of History. And I'm also Southern. And so what we're going to do is we're going to treat this, this is an academic forum, but I want to give you a way to sort of think about what you're participating in. And you're participating in a conversation, right? You're participating in a conversation, and this conversation is entitled The Report in 1965, Economics, Poverty, and Race Then. The panelists will discuss the correlations of economics, race, poverty during the 1950s and 1960s that Moynihan addressed in his report. Panelists will also discuss the changing industrial nature of urban America, the rise of suburbs, and the impact of the second Great Migration. And the panelist for today is Dr. Mauricia John, and she's in the Sociology department here at Kutztown. And then we have Patricia Derr. She's in the history program, so she's a fellow historian. And a fellow Southerner. Where you from? Oh, right now. Okay. See, that's what Southerners do. Okay, so we'll just stop and pause for a quick second and say, where are you from? Try to GPS you. Yeah, in 2 seconds. That's how we operate. And then we have James Jackson, who's in the psychology department. Mobile, Alabama. Oh, my goodness. Now, see, guess what? He grew up about 45 miles. I'm from Gulfport, Mississippi. He's east of me. And then we have Dr. Yasoda Sharma from the social work department. And so what we're going to do is that normally I would give, and I would like to give you something to discuss, a sort of a result, if you will, and then we can go from there and let the conversation happen organically. And so what we're going to do is probably discuss roughly about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to question and answers. So what we're going to make sure is that you all represent. And from the audience, I would like for you all to be trying to listen to what they're saying and perhaps create and construct a question for the audience, for the panelists. And so with that, with no further ado, here's a scenario. I live in a town called Coatesville, Pennsylvania. Coatesville, Pennsylvania is roughly, let's say, 40% looking at the impoverished rate. And one of the pieces that Moynihan talked about in this report is that people who are college educated, and if they're African American, they still have a tendency to live in impoverished areas. And guess what? I'm a living witness of that. So I have a higher income being a college professor, and yet and still I live in an area that's very impoverished. In fact, let me tell you, to give you some wording, the average high-income black person lives in a neighborhood with a higher poverty rate than the average low-income white person. So let me say that again. The average high-income black person lives in a neighborhood with a higher poverty rate than the average low-income white person. So I think that really speaks to the report itself, and it will allow you to navigate between all of the aspects that the panel promised to do. So with that, would anyone like to respond first, and then we can have this conversation organically? Anyone like to respond first to what I just said or talked about? The fact that I'm a college professor and I live in a town that is overwhelmingly impoverished. Well, not overwhelmingly, but it has a high percentage of poverty in comparison to the rest of Pennsylvania. And in fact, this is in a county that is the richest county in Pennsylvania, which is Chester County.
Just started off here. It seems to me that part of what we're seeing here is what Moynihan referred to as de facto segregation. That we all choose a neighborhood where we feel the most comfortable. Throughout the Philadelphia area, and it's certainly now, but looking back at the 50s and 60s, there was informal redlining in Philadelphia and throughout the suburbs. And so you see the clusters of African Americans of all socioeconomic types in a particular area. And even though redlining has been declared unconstitutional, I think over time it has become informal, only because whites will tend to live in one area of a community, whereas African Americans will live in another area. And even now, it seems to me that, speaking as someone who does live in an integrated neighborhood, there are still some whites who regard an African American family, even if they have the exact same income, moving into a white neighborhood as outsiders. And I think that was one of the things that Moynihan was addressing, in the notion of the clustering of poverty-stricken areas. And let me shoot off on that too, because one of the things that I thought about as I was reading all of the information, kind of preparing for this, and this comes from my own background. When I first started working, I worked in Dallas, and this was 30 years ago. But there was East Dallas is the most poverty-stricken area of Dallas. There's also was then industries that, among other things, produced an enormous amount of lead contamination. And this was in the early 1980s. All of a sudden, it clicked that, well, maybe the children who are growing up in this poverty-stricken area of East Dallas are not intrinsically dumber than everyone else. They've been poisoned, and they are being continually poisoned. And when I was reading all of the material for Moynihan, thought, because he does address some of the issues of education. I mean, he doesn't really go into it. But it seems to me that what we're dealing with here is a problem with multiple causes, and that you cannot point to one answer and say, this is it.
Well, back then, there was something called the black community. Mm-hmm. And I think what Moynihan failed to realize in his report was, back then, African Americans wanted to live with each other. The options of where we could do that safely, with the aspect of having decent housing, was very limited. Mm-hmm. So one of the things he wrote in his report was that if a middle-class black family wanted to be middle class, they were going to be middle class next door to a low-income family or neighborhood. But the aspect of that, right, was that we didn't have many options of where we could go at that particular point in time. So we were forced into these particular areas. But black doctors, black lawyers, black teachers, mm-hmm. we tended to then all congregate together around each other, which was one of the positive things. And with integration that came, shortly after that, that black neighborhood and those black communities dissipated. So now, due to urbanization, we don't have those kind of hubs of center of black communities. And so one of the things, I'm not sure if he was actually talking about, he didn't actually address the issue that we did not have equal access to move to other areas. Mm-hmm. But when we did, unfortunately, it was the demise of something that was very near and dear and precious to us.
I don't want to interrupt him. So I think Moynihan's report is really interesting, and it's really interesting because 50 years later we're dealing with some of the same problems. And to address your example, you're a college professor and you're living in a town where there are high levels of poverty. I think it's really interesting. And Patricia, you said that people tend to live where they feel comfortable. And so today we have an issue of what we call double consciousness amongst the African American community, right? And so in sociology we talk about that a lot, right? This idea that a lot of African Americans are gaining upward mobility, right? And they're black middle class, but at the same time, they're not totally accepted in the white middle class community, and they're still not totally accepted in the black underclass community. So for African Americans, they have this idea of double consciousness. They're kind of living two lives, right? And the acceptance and where they feel comfortable and where they feel accepted, it's a big struggle for a lot of blacks in America today.
But back then, if we had the money to buy, I know my family who is from the South, as they got additional resources, my grandmother wanted to keep us around a center where she had support because she was one of those single mothers at the time. But as my uncles and other things started to increase and housing did become available, because my uncles who were working were bringing money back into the home, my aunts were going away to college, right? Even when we had a chance to move, we chose to stay where our roots were, where our people were, right?
James, do you think that there is a difference in the way that black communities were organized in the South as opposed to in the North? Because I'm thinking of well-established African American communities like Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, where you did see, and you still see, I think, a variety of incomes. Yeah. But it seems to me that was something lost? Can we trace that something to the Second Great Migration that happens, starting right after World War II, where the African American population becomes much more northern and much more urban than it ever had before?
As Dr. John said, that's where that double consciousness comes in. Right?
Okay, when I hear double consciousness, I think Du Bois.
Yeah,
Yeah.
One of the things that he does address is that he talked about how when African Americans first moved when they were in the South, he said there was a level of destabilization. And then when they moved into the North, they, the family, because of just the pressures of, segregation, discrimination, lack of, job opportunities, that the family became even more, quote unquote, under threat.
That's right.
And so I guess then the question is, organically what's emerging here is that, are we now articulating that from the economic standpoint, there were benefits in segregation? Because in essence, that's what I'm actually hearing. And so therefore that would really counter what Moynihan was, basically arguing, because his general argument is that if you could have blacks and white, or non-whites and whites living together, then a lot of the social ills will go away. But in essence, but he also says that's what's happening in the North, in the Northeast, in the urban areas, is that class becomes very crucial, and that class separates people. So in essence, we have this, it's being conflated and leveled because you have this element of race, but then you have this element of class. And then you have the element of urban, right, situations, and that could impact how gender is performed. And so therefore, with that said, let's see just to some contemporary examples. So let's first unpack the first one. Are we arguing then that there were some elements, as you said, Dr. James, that there were some benefits in the system of segregation in the aspect of multi-income, therefore people were exposed to various types of people, whereas today, what appears to be progress is actually now been hit with class segregation. So now folks, because of the integration programs that were out, they are now in communities where you're seeing, poverty on top of poverty. There's no counterbalance. There's no antithesis. So.
Well said.
Yeah. I agree.
Well said, yes. The one thing I would take away from that was that let's remove the word segregation for a moment, and just say, was there a benefit? Did Moynihan miss, right, that there were direct benefits from having community? And the answer to that question is yes, right? In the rush to try to explain the ills of the African American community back then, he failed in this report to talk about the overall benefits of having those communities together and what you would lose, right, once integration came in, and what that would do to a people not having themselves grounded around people who look like them. In this report, it basically dealt with blacks, but there were Irish communities, there were Polish communities, there were Italian communities, right? And no one can overlook the benefits of having those groups of people cluster together. But in this report, right, he doesn't address those issues. What did the community lose? So I like the way you said it, but I'll take segregation up because that's what we were dealing with at the time. But in the aspect of having the black males go off to the armies, right? There were a group of African American boys and girls, right, who were at home without male figures because they were away. In those great migrations where the dads or the uncles did go north, right, to send money back home, as my uncles did, we lost communities. And then this kind of stretching out of our community to get back to the north. So in my family history, we go from Mobile to Columbus to Chicago to Baltimore, because that's how the males went, and that's how our communities kind of stretched out of it. So there was something lost, and he did not cover in this report those great things, having multi-layered people around. It was something nice about seeing a black doctor in your neighborhood, or a black teacher, right? And I would argue that in your neighborhood, there's something nice about having you there, right? that those young urban black women can see, right? Because a lot of the times our African American students make it to this particular level and seek us out because they did not have those particular role models in their own communities. And he misses that.
Well, I think he talks about family a lot, which if you group families together, that's community, right? So he doesn't explicitly talk about community, but, I guess more on a micro level with the family, the household and stuff, which is why I believe that Moynihan's report is more of a cultural report as opposed to a structural report, right? So if we address education in these inner cities, if we address employment in these inner cities, and I'm not saying he didn't address it, he did, but it wasn't explicit in his report, right? So if we focus on these things and build up the African American families, and by extension communities, then these African American families could then live and function well, as opposed to having this welfare dependency, having this female-headed household, right? Having this lack of father figures, having this absence of males in their families. So, when I read the report, I was just like, well, it sounds good, it makes sense, it's still happening today, but because a huge structural component was missing from the report, and it was so individual level based, it really missed a lot of issues. He did touch on employment, but at the same time, when slavery was abolished, we had the Great Migration, these African Americans were moving for jobs, well, what kinds of jobs will be moving for? It wasn't necessarily the most highly paid jobs, right? And then we had white flight, right? We had the rise of the suburbs. Whites moved. They didn't want to live amongst African Americans, and with them, jobs moved. And so we had this, high rates of unemployment and this perpetuation of poverty, which he referred to as the entangled pathology, right? So we see this happening, but again, I feel it's more of a structural problem as opposed to a household or family problem. So he frames it more in a cultural way as opposed to a structural way, which I think is more important.
But, and I do agree, but what about the neighborhoods like the Wally Hill Street District in, Pittsburgh? Harlem was a thriving community for African Americans. The African American dollar, that $1 turned over in our communities some 95 times before it left, which led to black businesses, which led to black lawyers, doctors, teachers, nurses, ambulance. You can name the gamut of what was in those communities. That was beautiful. It was a structural problem, right?
And so what I'm hearing is this, and I think that the audience, you all can identify with this, because in the last panel, we sort of brought up this idea of the stigmatized black body. And so therefore, we're now again going back to what is about this black or this white flight. And so that said, let me ask this question. So are you arguing indirectly that integration created less community and more hoods? I am going to say it, but I wanted to settle for a minute.
Yeah.
That, for example, so the audience can get ready for their questions, because in a few minutes we're going to turn it to the audience so they can have some input in this conversation, is that if I say that person lives in a hood, is it already understood in your head what that means? And so therefore, what Moynihan is saying here, even though he talks about the housing discrimination, and he talks about how, if actually even if blacks control the organized crime in their community, that they can have more money if they control the crime.
Right.
But blacks don't even control the crime in their community. Right? The crime actually comes outside. And so, therefore the wealth go right back outside. So the crime happens there in that space, but the money flows out of the community. So with that said, when we started talking about this idea of let it be double consciousness, let it be areas in East Dallas, let it be Philadelphia, North Philly, are we now saying that what we perceive to be a solution, and because what most people will say that the predictions that he made in this report have come true. Mm-hmm. And not only have the predictions come true, but they've actually are worse than what he said that it would be. Because now the spillover is not just for black communities, but now for white communities. Because we're looking at in America, and I've said this before and I'll probably say it again, is that roughly 48% of children born in America today are born to a one-parent household. Now, that number, when you put race with it, with African Americans, becomes 72%. So you're looking at roughly 3 out of every 4. Okay? But then generally in America, you're looking at 1 out of every 2. So with that said and done, when we sort of look at this idea of urbanness, or urban can be anything, because you can have an urban area in the most rural area. Mm-hmm. Right? If you go to Bula Bula, Alabama, and there's a track, people will say, over there in that urban side, and they only got a Piggly Wiggly. Yeah. And so what happens is that, urban is one of those code words. So what happens is that, are we now saying that part of what we thought a solution would be was actually what he underestimated was the role that class would play? because class would now even further segregate people on racial lines, and then most definitely on economic lines.
Leading to shows like Blackish.
And its predecessor, the Cosby
It's the
Show.
Cosby Show, yeah.
Yeah.
I basically feel that Moynihan's report was unidimensional, and he tried to diminish the importance of.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Is it not working?
So I feel that he tried to diminish the importance of the systematic racial discrimination by overemphasizing on reversed gendered role. And basically, some of the things that he kept talking about in his report was with regards to the female-headed household and how there was a structural issue with the female-headed household. So I personally believe that the emphasis should have been placed on the strengths perspective. It is clear from the history that the reason for the high rate of female-headed household amongst the African American family was because of the serious assault on the family as an institution. And also, instead of viewing female-headed family as a weakness, it would have been better if it would have been viewed as a strength. And we need to emphasize on the fact that the strength of the African American females who promoted more of the egalitarian society as opposed to the patriarchal society. So I just feel that he failed to address the important issue of egalitarian society.
And that is going to go back to something else that you just said. Not only did he talk about that, because again, the reason I brought up how many children are actually born in a particular household is because if we take his thesis to be accurate, then now we're going to sort of see long run, let's say in the next 50 years, you're going to see a different society. Because in essence, you know, you're going to have these climb in numbers of all groups across all ethnic groups. And exactly what will that do economically when you only have one parent making money? Or and then you have a household of four, 3 or 4 children. What is the spill out of that? How does that impact us? And then I'm going to add just another layer on sort of this urban issue, and then it's going to be sort of time for us to go into this discussion. But one of the things that when we were talking about poverty, race, and urban, I don't think that Moynihan actually could have foresaw. He could not have foreseen, rather, he could not have seen the rise of the prison industrial complex.
That's right.
That's true.
He could not have foreseen that. So therefore, when we look at not only poverty, not only education, you know, it's a lot of interconnectedness here, but he also could not have known that America, that's only 5% of the world's population, will be the most imprisoned nation. We would not look at areas in Philadelphia where the schools are being shut down, but we're building prisons for $400 million. That's a current project that was just in Philadelphia Inquirer just yesterday. Right? So we couldn't have seen that one of our big money makers was not going to be industry. Well, it was going to be industry, but industry when we're talking about warehousing people in jail and bringing them through a system, giving them fines, giving them whatever, that was going to be a way to generate income. And so now that actually helps to further destabilize. And particularly, again, and it's not just a black problem, it becomes a class problem if you start talking about how people, if the average child's average person's first child is a single parent household, what is the spill out of that in 50 years? So the conversation that we're having here will be somewhat different in 50 more years because in essence, more people would have saw the generational impact. So what do I mean by that? So those of you who are in college now, according to Moynihan and his report, you can have a generation who can actually do better than their parents. But then their children will actually do worse. And so if we're sort of looking at the the interrelatedness of poverty, poor schools, because right now public schools are under attack. We're looking at this prison industrial complex. We're looking at the involuntary segregationist programs, and then sometimes it's not involuntary. I mean, it's not voluntary. It's very, like you take a town, I know towns in Pennsylvania, let me just say it like this, that you have county commissioners who will basically compartmentalize the poverty into one pocket of a county. And so therefore the rest of the county can thrive, but then they got a one poor area, and everyone wonder how did all those poor people get there? Well, if all the housing vouchers are there, and then these people have to go out of their communities to go and get go to the grocery store to get an apple, to go get a banana. So what is the spill out of those type of aspects? So you've heard the panelists, and so now because this we have roughly about 13 minutes, 14 minutes. Let's have some questions from the audience. Okay, we have one, we have two, and I guess we have three, okay, four. All right, so I will be, be passing along the mic.
Let me give you a background that we're talking about Raleigh, North Carolina, and I'm Linda Pastor, retired professor from Indiana University. Moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, and I have a bridge partner. Bridge is a game that old people play, okay? And she is really good, and she's willing to give me lessons because you have to bid together. So she says, come over to my house. I live in the hood. Is that okay with you? And I said, sure, just give me the address. So I'm driving into a little bit south Raleigh, and I get to her street, and I thought, what kind of hood is this? These are $500,000 homes. And, okay, this is the hood. So I said, Mildred, what hood is this? She said, this is called Bishop's Row, because the people who live here, 4 out of the 10 houses are lived in by ministers of the AME churches. And this is the fanciest row of the hood. But like I said, it still didn't look like a neighborhood of the hood. So I go in, and we're studying, bridge, and she's really good at math and bridge, and I'm just like hopeless. And then she looks out her porch, and she jumps up and goes out the street and says, Sean, screaming, Sean, you do your homework. And he scuttles back in the house. And what I'm trying to say is the cultural connect is when Hillary Clinton says it takes a village to raise a child in that community, all the adults, the stay-at-home whomevers, felt comfortable if they saw a kid at 5 o'clock in the afternoon going outside. Did he do his homework? Everyone was raising everyone, and that's part of the wonderfulness to me of being in a community where you feel comfortable enough to run outside and help your neighbor. So there is a real cultural, to me, benefit that is lost.
Okay, so we've now heard that piece, and that goes to what you were saying, Dr. James. And so would anyone like to elaborate on the comment about the loss, that loss? And as I go up here, I did see some hands, but I got everyone's hands, but I'm going to start back here in the back. I see 2 students' hands, and then I come up, okay? All right.
Actually, let me just elaborate just a little bit, because I think we were talking about community, but I think we also were talking about support.
Yes.
And that's what's really being lost, is that sense that, because I hope all of us grew up in those kinds of neighborhoods where you kind of sort of knew that if you misbehaved, somebody was going to tell your mama. I mean, there was no, but there was a safety level there too. And it seems that perhaps in the urbanized African American community, the support of the larger group perhaps has been lost.
And the thought that at one particular point in time, what we call the welfare system for persons of color, it was a pride issue. You did not want to take the government cheese. You did not want to have to be seen going to get the canned milk, right? And so when you talk about support, it's the type of support, right? And I don't think he made a distinction between those particular things.
Exactly, because I was talking about, emotional and psychological
Correct.
support, and we're all in this together.
Right.
Yeah.
And even for a lot of single mother families, they have his support,
Correct.
right? So he says, we have this pathology happening, and it's as a result of single parenting, single mothers. But statistics have shown that for single mothers, they have a kin network that really, help to raise children. And so you may not have the father present, but you may have an uncle present, or you may have a grandmother present, or an aunt
Or a
present.
church member.
Or a church member present. So, again, it speaks to the whole network and kin network for African American families.
Okay, we have another question.
Hello? My mother, she grew up in like a very bad neighborhood in LA. And I just remember her talking like, yeah, the community was really rich, but I noticed that there was no resources available really to get out.
Right.
There was no resources to have a life that was stable, especially after welfare reforms that happened throughout that era and even recently. There was no way to really get above a minimum wage. And I noticed that when you're in that situation, she saw that it was much easier to kind of like join a group of people who were together in this fight against the people who were pressing you down, and you could do something that everybody else saw as illegal, as wrong, but that's going to help you and your community get above that threshold of minimum wage, of that like tyrannical imperial pressure. And like with regards to that whole industrial prison complex, that the nature of how we've evolved and how the community's evolved. Like my mom, she's not African American, but she did notice that like her community was filled with African Americans, and like her stepfather was African American. She also noticed that like she had no father figure, and like father figures just came and they went, and they came and they went. And I don't like with regards to that whole complex and that whole situation. Is it a trap? Like, how do you feel about that?
Well, I feel like if it goes back to the whole.
Hold on 1 second. Thank you so much for sharing that, and thank you so much for sharing that. And now, you want to respond?
I think it goes back to the whole issue that it's more of a structural problem, right? So you have this lack of job opportunities, you have this lack of, proper schools, lack of education, right? And we all know the key out of poverty is education. And so if you have people living in these pockets of society where schools are not adequately equipped with resources, with technology, with teachers to, help children climb out of poverty, you have this culture of poverty, this chronic multi-generational poverty that keeps reproducing itself from across generations, right? And that's why initially at the beginning of the panel I said it's a structural problem. It's a structural problem more so than a cultural problem, right? We have to attack why are these things happening before we even, say, well, it's the lack of fathers, right? It's a single mother thing. It's a breakdown in family. Well, why are these families breaking down, right? Why do we have these fathers leaving? Why do we have these children being born out of wedlock, right? We have to address the why. And so it goes back to structure of society, right? Institutionalized discrimination, lack of education, lack of jobs, right? All of these things definitely reproduce this culture.
Well, we do have another question. We have several questions. We have just a few minutes, but I do want to say that I don't know how many of you saw the PBS special called American Denial, but it revisits the arguments that's put by Gonnar Mundell in his book American Dilemma. And what you're describing is this element of alienation. What does alienation from a community, what does it produce? And therefore, if you can alienate people enough in society, you can almost create a client base for the prison industrial complex. And that's the sinister part. It was the hand.
Yes. I would like to give my opinion on how, Black African Americans that they have a good job and they tend to live in a high poverty area, that it might be because they don't feel like they fit in the suburbs. how like they might be coming home late from work and get stopped by the police because they feel like they don't belong there just because they're black.
And anyone like to respond to that? Anyone would like to respond to that? Or yeah.
Well said.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that becomes a very crucial, and it's not only just for the people who work there, but if you have children. I remember for me, as I go to the next person, there was someone else back here who had their hand up before I go down. But I can remember I got a job offer in Washington State, and what happened was that it came with this. Well, you know, between Spokane and Pullman, you have to be very careful. I said, yes, I'll be very careful not to take this job. And so what happens is that's that idea of, you know, because there's a lot of white supremacist groups in there, you have to be extra careful. And at the, you know, you already have to, everyone individually have to already police themselves in so many ways that I did not want, for a few dollars, I didn't want to jeopardize my safety.
But he says it in his report. There's a difference between liberty and equality. Right, that African Americans gain liberty, but they did not gain equality. And he said you have to deal with that basic issue about equality before any of this is going to be able to change.
I just want to make a comment about the prison industrial complex with the League of Women Voters. When you're a prisoner, when you're an ex-con, and even when you get out, when you're still on parole, you can't vote. And when you get off parole, you should re-register to vote, assuming that you were registered beforehand. If you're on probation, I believe you can vote. But when you have a community where a very large number, any number of people are in the complex for many years, rightly or wrongly, and then there's that parole period, easy to get off parole too, you can't vote. You can't do things like vote in municipal elections and improve the schools or make those decisions.
And so now we only have, I know we have one more comment, and I was hoping that someone who wanted to ask a question was going to ask, but what happens is that
what we're going to do now is going to have this last comment, but it's very interesting. So now what we're looking at is a society that supports, so if everyone always sort of give you the general idea that we live in a society that has first-class citizenship, but what you just described was that we live in a society that fosters, if we're not careful, second-class citizenship, and there's a whole element of just what that means.
I'm sorry we didn't get to.
Just to add to what you were saying about segregation, I think in hindsight it's very easy to say he didn't address the consequences of ending segregation, but there was no way for him to see the white flight of the late 60s, 70s, and even the 80s, due to, exacerbated by the riots and then, you know, the resulting high rates of poverty and crime in the 80s and everything. And then, of course, the war on drugs, get tough on crime, and, of course, which is concentrated on poor black urban communities for it. But But I think, I mean, while it's important to, you know, address racial, you know, or look at race to address racial issues, I do feel like we maybe separate classes by race a little too much, separate lower class between white groups and black groups. I think we need to address, and there should be more data available specifically on income, poverty rates, and everything for it. One of the encouraging things is finally, after decades, almost 100 years of decline of urban areas, now there is a resurgence of cities investing in downtown renaissance and things like that, which can finally benefit the lower class, the underclass, resulting from the mass incarceration. But do you feel that we should probably start collecting more data on class instead of just based off of race?
That's the question, but guess what? We're going to have to leave because this is time. And so it was a great panel. So before we do that, if you would stay for the next panel, we'll address that question. We'll start off with that. But what happens is let's give our panelists a round of applause. And you can also see the quality of scholars that you have here. And so therefore, think about taking some of their classes if you're not in their classes. And if you are some in their classes, take some more. All right? Peace and progress.
All right, so what did you think about today's panel?
Oh, I thought it was very interesting, especially the second panel. How, what I liked it how all the members had discussions, and poverty is like really main thing that involves in my life. How I come from a single mother of 3 children, and we came really down from a shelter down to buying a house. So it really brings out to me of my childhood, basically.
Cool. What stuck out to you the most about the discussion?
I would like to say it will be the question that I asked, which was how African Americans that have well-paying job, they tend to live in a high poverty area, and my opinion was because how they feel like they don't fit in the suburbs. How they might come home late from work and they might get stopped by the police officer because they feel like you don't belong here because you're African American.
All right, so what did you think about today's discussion?
I was very interested. They drew in a lot of points on some of like the cultural, the structural dynamics of our communities as a whole. Really drawing on to African Americans in general and a very common struggle that you don't even have to really go into a ghetto to see. You can go into any community and you can notice this as a very deep-rooted problem in our society. And I thought it was very interesting.
Yeah.
They drew on a lot of good points.
Cool. What stuck out to you the most about the discussion?
Their comments on the prison industrial system. I really thought that was very interesting. They talked a lot about how it was almost like a system where it was set up to where people they're kind of like they're in this community and they're just in this almost like a toilet bowl, just flushing down into this system. And then they talked about how they drew on points about how it's hard to vote. I know somebody asked a question and stated that like parolees can't vote, and that makes it very hard, especially when communities got a high density of parole, like people like that. And yeah, I thought that was interesting.